Hey everybody, welcome back to 10% True. 10% True is now not only a YouTube channel, but also a podcast. So you can get this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, any of the usual suspects. If you have downloaded this as a podcast and you're listening with audio only, thanks very much, appreciate it. Please feel free to leave a review, to subscribe. But also note, the best way to enjoy 10% True is using YouTube, because there's typically images or video that goes along to help enrich the experience. This week's guest is Rich Cooper. He's a very experienced aviation photographer, has worked in the aerospace and defense industry for many years. I'm trying out a new format with him, which I describe in the video, so I'll stop talking and let you enjoy. Take care. Rich, thanks for joining us on 10% True. Appreciate your time.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it all day.
So I'll just explain for the people that are watching or maybe even listening on the podcast, the format. This is sort of an experiment that you and I have pretty much come up with together just through the process of talking on social media. So originally, I'm a big fan of your photography. Originally I wanted to talk to you about that. And I had sort of very lazily said, well, can you just pick some of your favorite shots and we'll go through those. And then I think you sort of challenged me and you said, well, do they have to be my favorite shots? And that sort of got me thinking, and I think together we came up with the idea that you could maybe just pick sort of 5 or 6 shots that are notable to you for whatever reason. That doesn't necessarily have to be the most visually stunning images, but for some reason there's a story or there's something that you would maybe sort of describe to people that they wouldn't necessarily see in the image itself. So that's the format. So it's sort of a desert island discs, but for a photographer.
Yeah, no, I really liked it. It was a bit different to the usual, what's your favourite shots this year, or that kind of format. So I really enjoyed the challenge of it, actually. It was far harder than I expected. So you very graciously let me have a couple of more images that I could talk about tonight. But yeah, they're not necessarily, as you say, like my absolute best, most technically amazing shots. Certainly not actually in a couple of cases, but it was the desert island bit that really struck me. I thought that's a really cool idea. If I only had those 6 images with me on an island and the memories and the kind of the connection that they had to me, then what does that mean? What does that look like? So I really enjoyed the process. It was a cool exercise.
Excellent, cool. Well, so let's, before we look at the photographs, or again, if someone's listening to this and not watching it, maybe before we describe them. Can we hear a little bit about you? So you're Rich Cooper. Probably a lot of people will have seen your work, not necessarily have associated with your name. There probably are a lot of people who know your name too. But can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've done it a long time, which is probably why people are sick of my name, I guess. But I've actually held a camera in my hands since I was 7 years old. My dad is a photographer, still is photographer, journalist, that kind of stuff. And he gave me his Olympus OM10 in 1982 to use. I was 7, and at the 82 Farnborough Air Show, and I just loved it. The flying was very different then, and the whole engagement with air shows and the access you could have was very different. So I was pretty much hooked. And I live in Farnborough. I'm talking to you from my Farnborough office right now, and I can see the approach out the window from where I sit at the moment. So I'm born and bred in Farnborough, and then shooting at Farnborough as my first show. I was pretty much hooked. My dad was also a Farnborough apprentice and went out to Saudi as a crew chief on Lightnings, and my grandfather was based at Farnborough at the Royal Naval Air Department, and developed the whole kind of aircraft carrier system of traps and hooks and catapults and everything else. So it's absolutely in my blood. I had no chance. So just going on holiday with them, I would get it would obviously be some sort of aviation theme, much to my mother and sister's disgust. But I remember going into Lucas one day, and I think it was 111 Squadron had some new markings on a Phantom, and we were able to just get on base back then in those days. And I photographed this thing coming out of the HAZ, sent it to Aviation News, and at 11 I had my first picture published. So there's a real hook. It really got. I love seeing that on the shelf. It was fantastic. And I still do today. It's a weird thing, but I love seeing. It's just a great buzz seeing your work in print. So I wanted to go in the RAF as a photographer. That kind of stemmed that interest. But right at that same time, it really hit the first SDSR hit, the first white paper hit of all the massive cutbacks that was coming in at that time. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity to join the RAF at that time. So they said, go away and do something useful, which I did. So I went and worked in a camera shop. And it was a really good time. It not only taught me sort of to deal with difficult customers and customer relations and all that kind of stuff and phone management. I was only like 16, 15, 16, 17. But also got to learn all the different camera manufacturers and started getting into that side of things really well. So the boss at that time was a Minolta user, so he said to stick with the Minolta. So that's what I did. I very loyally stuck through that and got rid of my Practicas that I was using. Went into Minolta and then just sort of like got more and more into it. I could obviously access a bit of discount working in a shop. So I continued to do a bit of freelance self publishing here and there, taking my day off on a Thursday. And Jamie Hunter, who's another guy you might know very well, he also had a day off on Thursday, so he just used to travel around the UK in all the times when those exercises were going on and shoot and send stuff into magazines. If there was an article that was worthy to write, then we'd sit down and do that as well. It was a good time. I then joined an aviation data supply company, which my dad actually worked for, based at Heathrow. And that saw me quickly get into the editing side because they had a load of publications. There was like there was a monthly one, a weekly one, a biannual one, a bi-monthly one, and an annual one that I was eventually editor of. And it was the weekly one that was much more like the full-on journalist side of things, you know. So I was out there talking to airlines and seeing what they were doing with their routes and their plans and their fleet disposals, all that kind of thing. And I on one of those press trips, it was up to Sweden, Malmo Air's first ever RJs, believe it or not. And I met the the editor of Aircraft Illustrated, Alan Burney, and he needed a deputy. So we got talking, went for a job interview, which consisted of 2 hours talking about what music I like. Not no no real job interview at all, and we just hit it off. And I think that's really important in this industry. If you connect with someone and the work side of things can follow, you know. So I joined and I was editor of Combat Aircraft and Aircraft Illustrated for 10 years, between 98 and 2008. And then I left and did something completely different with my life. I ran a youth charity here in Aldershot, near where I live. And in that sort of time, I didn't really do much aviation, but it's, as I said right at the start, it's well in my blood. You know, it is who I am. So couldn't kill it completely, and it sort of slowly raised its head again, and I got back into it, and I set up the Centre of Aviation Photography, which actually has got its legacy from back when I was editor of the magazines, because we set up a readers club back then that allowed our readers to go out and visit squadrons and air bases that we were writing articles on. I would talk to the base and say, look, we're doing an article in the magazine. I'd like to bring some of my readers over to really experience it as well. And back then it was a lot easier because 9/11 hadn't happened and the security in the whole world was a different place. So it was a great time of unrestricted military access, which looking back on now is quite remarkable. But so I set that format back up again about 5 years ago in the format of the Centre of Aviation Photography, which is now very much my full-time job.
So how many members do you have?
It's about 2,500, something like that.
And is it if it's not a silly question, is it a commercial venture?
Yeah. It's in its fifth year, and I think if any business survives the first three, they say it's going to be okay, right? But it's not easy. There's no way, not easy at all. It's a very tough, competitive market, and we offer something that's I really believe in. You know, it's all about the experience of aviation and the adventure of it all for photographers. And you don't have to be a professional. You don't have to be a newcomer. You can just come out and enjoy your photography. We travel the world, offering that sort of experience, whether it's like 2 or 3 days at a time, or a week, or 2 weeks at a time. Literally just come back from Japan for 2 weeks ago. That was really cool. Great trip. And I'm away for about 25, 30 weeks a year, something like that. Right. So it's pretty intense. Yeah, so there's a lot of work goes into that. And we also offer workshops and seminars and courses and all that kind of stuff as well. So yeah.
Okay, Rich. So tell us about the first picture you've chosen to take to this imaginary desert island.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I absolutely love to do is concentrate my efforts on aircraft that are going out of service. Something that stems back to the kind of early 2000s, when there were a lot of really cool types disappearing from our skies. And probably my first three I'm going to talk about in particular are really special to me for that reason, and not just because of, as I said earlier, not just because of what the type is, and it's a nice shot, but also kind of the effort and what it meant to be doing it as well at the time. So my first shot I'm going to talk about is the three ship of F117s in the sunset. That was unbelievable. I mean, I'd let you into a bit of a secret. A few people know this, but I get really airsick. So shooting from a back seat of a fast jet is a real challenge for me, and it's something you get desensitized to. So I'm a lot better now. I mean, this was 2008. This image was taken, so 10 years ago, more. And I was still pretty green, literally. See what I did there? And yeah, being in the backseat of the cockpit with the mask on your face and the HUD here, you know what it's like, and you've got, it's all compressed and claustrophobic. You're looking through a camera and you're zooming, and my inner ears don't like that. It doesn't kind of work out what's happening. So I actually had to, in the brief of that, I actually had to build into the brief specific vomit time so that everyone knew that we were on the same, seriously, everyone, we're on the same page, that if, when I said, okay, I need a minute, what they'd do, where they'd hang, if we were on that heading or this heading or whatever, and what the aircraft would do in terms of straightening out, straight level, and what the comms would be, where the switches were in the back so the guy in the front couldn't hear me, and all that jazz. It was really important, and obviously where to stow it and all that. So yeah, it's physically really hard for me to do stuff like that, although I have done a lot better recently. It was back in those days. It was pretty tough. So, and it represented a monumental effort of relationship building. I think, as no doubt you realise, that these opportunities don't just fall in your lap. And that shot, that sortie, was the very last air-to-air sortie undertaken with F117s, and it's just, I can't even believe it. Just sitting here saying that, even that it was these jets. They weren't like new build or upgrades or modernization of a previous type. These were the actual jets that were secret at Tonopah, that they were, it's those machines. And I was up there flying with them that sunset, and they're literally, like, I think it was 3 weeks, 4 weeks before they were retired officially. And it was phenomenal. The reason I chose that shot in particular, because it was, I flew with them. I think I flew 4 tanker sorties, 3 visits to Holloman, and a backseat ride. So it had quite a lot of engagement with the community. But the reason I chose that is because I had a real sensation of how good the pilots were for a start. I mean, they're all quite senior guys. They sort of started major upwards because of the type of role it was. So they're all pretty good on the stick and everything else. But I was literally asking my guy inches up and inches down so that I could get the sunset exactly where I needed it to be. So I've got shots in that sequence where the sun's kind of coming through the gap in his mask, even, I was just really precise, intricate movements. And I remember being able to feel the jet go backwards and forwards and up and down to my command. It was fantastic. And obviously, they flew it brilliantly. So sitting there briefing those pretty senior guys, the bandits, dude, actual bandits, and then executing it, and despite the physicalities of it, delivering the shot, that had to be him with me on the desert island.
Did you? I mean, we'll talk about. There's a theme that runs through your images. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit into this session. But did you? So you knew that was the shot you wanted, or that was a shot that presented itself at the time?
No, I absolutely wanted it, 100%. Yeah, the other half of that shoot was with the flag jet. They painted up a 117 with the American flag underneath. So we did the daylight portion of the sortie with that, and there were, I think, 5 or 6 different serials I wanted out of that. And then there were, I think, five serials out of the sunset as well. And then once, obviously, the sun was below the horizon, we RTB'd. So yeah, it's very deliberate.
One of the things, I mean, you've already characterised it. My experience is the same as yours, which is that when you first jump into the backseat of a high performance aircraft or fast jet, and you're wearing a G suit or
Yeah.
You're strapped into an ejection seat and you have a mask and a helmet. It is claustrophobic, and then you're trying to shoot through a viewfinder where you can't actually see the full frame anymore because you can't get it close enough to your face unless you drop the mask. And there are a bunch of things that maybe aren't evident to people who haven't done it before that of course the image doesn't convey. How if someone were to go along for their first flight tomorrow, and they wanted to capture a shot like that, what pieces of advice would you give them? What are the things that
Wow.
they should focus on?
That's a really good question. I mean, it's not that dynamic. It really isn't. That's if you know how to set the jets up, then that shot's pretty easy. You've got to know your camera really well, definitely. But I'm not upside down. I'm not pulling G's. We're straight and level. But what I have done is position the aircraft well, known my camera really well in terms of how it exposed sunsets and where I needed to meter and that kind of stuff, and the exposures I needed to do and everything else, and just given a really careful brief. I think I'm not a pilot in any way, shape, or form. These guys are incredible, right? But I know how I want the picture to look. So quite often it would be a case of, okay, this is what I like to do, and they either laugh or go, oh yeah, no, we can do that. How about modifying it this way? But I think as long as you're clear in communicating what you want and sit down with your pilots, your camera ship pilot and the guys you're shooting way ahead of time, way before the briefing happens, everything else, and just talk through what you need, what you want to achieve, and then let their incredible pilot brains work that through, and then form it into a formal brief. I think that's a real start. But I wouldn't, crikey, someone doing it for the first time tomorrow. It's a big deal. It really is. Make sure you're comfortable, make sure you're rested, make sure you eat. So if you are going to do something, there is something to bring up. Because I've done that too, and that's really painful. And yeah, just be clear of your objectives and don't try too much. But if you've done it a million times, like some of the other guys out there, I'm also super critical of. You get these incredible shooters of Jamie, Frank, Katsu, etc., and all those other amazing guys that do this far better than I do. And yeah, I've utmost of admiration for them, but they set the bar so high. I enjoy being quite critical of it.
So Rich, what's your second shot then?
Second shot is along the theme of the final stuff, and it's the F-14, the mighty Tomcat, and that's yeah, a very, very special time and image again.
So where were you when you shot this? Because this is for somebody who hasn't seen it or listening.
Yep.
It's a head-on shot looking down.
Yep.
So it's almost as though you're sort of hanging out of the back of an aeroplane. That's what it looks like you did.
Yep.
How did you get it?
Yep. So I was deployed out onto the Roosevelt during the OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom. It's the Tomcat's last ever cruise. And this was probably about a week before that cruise finished, and they set sail back for Oceania. So this was the last chance something like this could happen. And back in at that stage, for whatever reason, it was really, really difficult to go through Bahrain to get onto the carrier. There was, just for whatever reason, the security in Bahrain was ridiculous. And there was one particular guy on the desk that actually wouldn't let journalists through anymore. He'd had enough, so he had to literally wait and see kind of who was on the desk at the time at the security gate, and if it was him, then you had to kind of duck underneath and hope he didn't see you. And it was a nightmare. But I had 3 trips planned, built, paid for, done, approved, all cancelled. Probably just, I think, about like a day before I flew out there. So it was really, really tough to do. And I'd heard some horror stories of guys actually getting out there and being turned away at the gate, and or going through the actual gate itself and being hauled off back home. So it was a really tricky gig to get on. But if this guy wasn't on shift, then you were in. So it was a bit of cat and mouse on this one, just to even get on the boat, let alone get this far. So this was taken from a C2, a COD Greyhound, and it was on our flight back. I was actually with Katsu Tokunaga on this one, and we'd briefed the pilot, and he was incredible. Captain Bill Sizemore, he was the CAG at the time, and is pretty much, by all accounts, and proved to be as well the best F-14 stick that was left in the community. I mean, the shot is of the jet wings fully folded, and you think, he's flying that at about 130, 140 knots in a fully loaded, weaponized, heavy, fuel-laden F-14 behind a C2, and that took some serious airmanship. So it was, and literally he would have been the only pilot at that time left in the F-14 community that could have performed that kind of maneuver. So pretty cool. And it was all obviously always as it always is with air-to-air. There's a million factors going on, and you don't know if anything's going to happen until the jet's actually there and your camera's working and you've got the shots in the bag. There's nothing guaranteed at all. And for this, we were supposed to have 2 Tomcats behind us. But it's obviously, as I said, it was an operational mission. These guys were it was full OIF mode, and the Tomcat was a particularly in demand asset at that time as well because of the new rover updates that it received. It was a really intense battlefield, a really useful asset, and they had to have 2 Tomcats involved in a particular mission over the beach, as they called it. So to ensure there were 2 that actually crossed the border, they launched 4 off the deck. So we took off. We got launched in our C2 first. The air wing then did its launch as we bimbled back over to Bahrain, and the 4 jets pushed over to the border with hoping that 2 would make it, and 1 broke. So it had to RTB, which meant that one of our jets that we were photographing, one of the spares, then had to join the package. So they pushed over, they went over, and that left us with 1 aeroplane. And he then had to come back round and find us and join up with us. And that was quite an amazing sight. As you can imagine, having a Tomcat kind of in the distance, swinging into your view, and going through the serials that we'd briefed, and that to see it was obviously wings forward to start with while he was pretty heavy and gasping for air and everything else. As he got lighter, he was able to put the wings back a little bit and drop some flares and pull around. But that shot of that's there that you have of it, just the shape of it and how battered it is as well. I absolutely love the texture on top of the jet. So just the kind of, again, I suppose it's that represents the, if on this desert island, if the determination that if I really want something and I like to be told no, or I like to be told it's not possible, because it fuels me to really make it happen. So this was an impossible shoot, and it was an impossible target. It was the last day it could happen, on the very last month, the day of a 6, 7, 8 month cruise, and the jets were going to be retired. So this was it. It had to happen, and it did.
I think that's another thing that probably people don't really see or aren't really aware of, is the sort of, I want to say jeopardy. It's not really the right word, but you normally get one chance. If the weather's bad, if a jet breaks, if someone's ill, that's it. It's canned, and then you go home.
Yeah.
You don't get a spare, or there's no we'll try it again tomorrow. That's it.
I think that's always one of the surprises of people. I mean, it's it's another subject of another day perhaps, but the kind of like what they call the pay to play era. Where you get given a seat on a Skyvan and you point your camera at the back and take the shots, and that's amazing. It is an incredible thing that's happened to the photography world in that sense when it's done properly, and I mean properly. And it can look pretty easy, because you're literally sat there and the jet comes up or the aeroplane comes up and you take shots and you go home. And it's not cheap, and we know that, and that's the way it is. Air to air is not a cheap game, but it sometimes hides how difficult and how many years and years of relationship building goes into getting these air to air shots. And the heartache and the admin, oh my days, the admin and the time put into something like this. I mean, you certainly don't do this for the cash. That comes, if you factored in our time and everything else of making a shot like that happen, then it'd be horrifying. You'd just never do it. But instead you get, £150 for a front cover of a magazine, and it pays for your beer or something. But it's not why we do it. But it does mask the difficulties, as you mentioned a few earlier, and like, you've then got to add in the weather, the airspace restrictions, the mismatch of aircraft types of performance often, unless you're in a back seat, of course, which is another story. But and your gear, your physicalities, everything. There's so many factors, and so much of it can go wrong all of the time. And part of the skill involved in all of this, as I'm sure you realise as well, is not when it's right, is getting the shot, because those stealths, or that Tomcat is just sitting there, click. But it's the absolute skills and dedication and devotion and time and effort and resources and physicality, everything that it takes to get into that position in the first place to be able to take that photo, is the skill involved, as well as then delivering when you're up there.
Yeah. I think the other thing, I mentioned it in the previous shot, I didn't know when you were going to bring the F-14 up, but I think the other thing that is sort of thematic about your shots as well, and you mentioned it, is dynamism, or in your case, lack of it. And so for me, I personally, so art is subjective, so it doesn't mean there's a right or wrong, but I love simplicity. I love clever use of light. I love composition. I love background. And you mentioned, other photographers, perhaps being more skilled at producing those highly dynamic, really action-packed shots. And I doff my hat to them in the same way as you did, because it's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to do it. Well, a lot of people I think are doing it, and there are some people who are better at doing it than others. And just because you get 3 jets in a break doesn't mean that's a good shot. What you don't want, you don't want overlapping aircraft. You don't want, sort of odd breaks. You don't want things that just sort of jar people. So there is still an artistic element to it. But what I really liked about the F-14 shot is that it's just beautiful. It's soft light again. The mottled effect from where it's obviously been flying many missions. It's had no love. The corrosion of the paint, the sea salt, all of those things are captured in it. And then of course the beauty of the aeroplane itself, the shape of the aeroplane. It looks like a delta wing. So for me, you can, if you put those elements in, you don't have to have the dynamism. You don't have to have really clever stuff going on and flares pumping out and aircraft at odd angles. You can just have that. That is as good as any dynamic shot I've seen.
That's cool. Thank you. I like what you're saying.